For 30 years, this house had its own quiet rhythm, a gentle hum of memories. Then my son Leo brought his wife, Chloe, to stay after she'd lost her job. Suddenly, the familiar scent of old books and lemon polish was replaced by her sharp, floral perfume. She'd glide through my living room, her eyes not admiring, but assessing. They always landed on the antique music box my late husband gave me. And one evening, when she asked what was inside, her voice was sweet, but her gaze was sharp, like a jeweler appraising a stone. It was a look I recognized, the look of someone calculating your worth while you're still sitting right in front of them. If they've ever acted like you weren't there until your absence echoed louder than presence, share your story. And if this feels like your table too, like and subscribe. My name is Evelyn Reed, and for the better part of a decade, my life has been a study in quiet order. For nearly 40 years, my profession was to find the story hidden within numbers, to trace the ghost of a lie through columns and ledgers until it had nowhere left to hide. Being a forensic accountant trains you to see the world not just as it appears, but as a series of patterns and deviations. It teaches you that the smallest inconsistency, the slightest detail out of place, is often the beginning of a much larger story. Since my retirement, I've applied that same attention to detail to a simpler life here in Crestwood, a life measured by the bloom cycles of my garden and the slow, comforting ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. This clock, a wedding gift from my parents, has marked the passage of my entire adult life, the joy of my son Leo's first steps, the quiet grief after my husband Richard passed, and now, the unsettling stillness of a life lived alone, but not lonely. For 10 years since Richard's passing, the house on Sycamore Lane had settled into a rhythm that was entirely my own, a quiet cadence of classical music in the afternoons and the scent of jasmine drifting in through the open kitchen window. It was a peaceful existence, predictable in the best possible way. That peace was fractured not by a sudden storm or a crisis, but by something far more common: a phone call from my son. Leo's voice, usually so calm and measured, carried a frayed edge of stress that I recognized instantly. The same tone it had when he'd broken his arm at age 12 but tried to hide it from me. He explained the situation with a carefully constructed casualness that did nothing to hide his anxiety. His wife, Chloe, had been part of a sudden corporate restructuring at her marketing firm. The word he used was downsized, a sterile, impersonal term that felt like a shield for a messier, more painful truth. They were struggling, he admitted, his pride warring with his desperation. And he asked, with a hesitation that broke my heart, if they could possibly stay with me for a while, just until Chloe found her feet again. Of course, I said yes. This was Leo's childhood home, a sanctuary that would always be his. The day they arrived. However, I felt the first tectonic shift in the house's quiet foundation. It wasn't one single thing, but a collection of discordant details. Leo, usually so vibrant, looked exhausted, the lines around his eyes deeper than I'd ever seen them. He hugged me with a familiar warmth. But it was the hug of a man seeking refuge, not just a son saying hello. And then there was Chloe. She stepped out of the car with a smile so bright and determined it seemed to defy their circumstances. Her energy was brittle, a high-frequency hum of forced positivity that felt entirely out of place in the calm air of my home. Their belongings, packed into mismatched boxes and overflowing suitcases, spilled onto my manicured lawn, a visual representation of the chaos they were bringing into my orderly life. They settled into the guest room, and the house was no longer just mine. The gentle rhythm was replaced by a nervous, unpredictable energy. The quiet mornings were now filled with the sound of her blow-dryer. The evenings with the low murmur of reality television shows I found jarring. I tried to embrace the change, to be the gracious host and supportive mother. I cooked Leo's favorite meals and made space in my life for their routines. A few days after they arrived, I found Chloe in the living room, staring blankly at her laptop. I approached gently, offering to help with her resume, thinking my experience with complex financial documents might lend a useful eye. I've reviewed thousands of corporate filings. Dear, I said warmly, perhaps I can help you phrase your accomplishments. Chloe's reaction was immediate and defensive. Her smile tightened as she quickly closed the laptop. Oh, thank you. Evelyn, but it's all very specialized marketing jargon. It would probably just bore you. Her refusal was polite on the surface, but the underlying message was clear. Keep out? My offer was not seen as help, but as an intrusion. My professional instincts, long dormant, began to stir with a familiar sense of alert. I was observing a performance, a carefully curated narrative of a competent professional temporarily down on her luck. But I knew from decades of experience that such airtight performances were almost always designed to conceal a significant vulnerability. The initial disruption soon settled into a tense routine, and for a few weeks. I told myself I was simply being an overprotective mother, a solitary woman unaccustomed to sharing her space. I pushed my suspicions down, chalking them up to old habits dying hard. The true, undeniable red flag, the one my instincts could not ignore, did not appear until an evening in late autumn. The air had grown crisp, and I had made a pot roast, its savory aroma filling the house with a sense of warmth and normalcy that felt almost real. We were gathered at the dinner table, the conversation light, with Leo recounting a difficult but rewarding project at his architecture firm. I was watching my son speak, admiring the passion in his eyes and the confident man he had become. When I noticed Chloe's attention had drifted, her gaze was not on her husband, but on the mantelpiece across the room. It was fixed, locked onto the antique music box Richard had given me for our 20th anniversary. It was my most treasured possession, crafted from burled walnut with a delicate mother-of-pearl inlay of two hummingbirds. Richard had it commissioned. He said the two birds were us, always in motion but always together. It played Claire de Lune, the song that had been playing on the radio in his old Ford when he first told me he loved me. It was not overtly valuable in a monetary sense. Its worth to me was the entire architecture of our shared life. After a pause in the conversation, Chloe turned her bright smile on me, a spotlight of focused charm. Evelyn, that music box is absolutely exquisite, she said, her voice a warm, admiring purr that sounded perfectly genuine to an untrained ear. I thanked her, my voice catching slightly as I recounted its history. Leo smiled, adding a childhood memory of him sneaking into the living room just to hear the delicate notes. A story I had heard 100 times and cherished with each retelling. Chloe listened patiently, her head tilted in a gesture of rapt attention that I had seen lawyers use during depositions when the stories were finished. She leaned forward slightly, her fork resting on her plate. It looks so old and special, she continued, her tone still perfectly casual, perfectly innocent. I bet you keep your most important things in there. Don't you old love letters? Perhaps, or maybe some of your mother's jewelry. The questions, layered one after another like a careful interrogation, hung in the air. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Leo chuckled, a nervous sound in the sudden silence. Chloe, you can't just ask things like that, he chided gently, a hint of embarrassment in his voice. That's Mom's private business. Chloe waved a dismissive hand, laughing it off as if it were a silly, harmless joke. Oh, I'm just curious. You know me, I'm a romantic. I love hearing family stories. But I had seen it. I had seen it as clearly as a falsified number on a balance sheet, in the brief moment before she laughed. Her smile had faltered, and her eyes held a look of sharp, clinical assessment. Her gaze wasn't filled with romantic curiosity. It was filled with cold calculation. It was the same look I'd seen on the face of a CEO trying to hide millions in offshore accounts. A look that strips an object of its soul and sees only its potential value. She was not a sentimentalist admiring a symbol of a great love. She was an evaluator estimating the contents of a locked container. My years of work had been about reading the nuances behind a polite facade, about understanding that the most dangerous questions are always dressed in the guise of innocence. In that moment, watching my son's wife gaze at my husband's last gift to me, I felt a cold certainty settle in my bones. The performance was over. The appraisal had begun. And the sanctity of my home was now under threat from someone who was sleeping just down the hall. The certainty I felt after that dinner was a cold and unwelcome companion in the days that followed. It settled in my house like a fine layer of dust, invisible to the casual eye but a constant grit under my skin. My home, once a sanctuary of peaceful order, now felt like an observation room. I watched the way Chloe moved, the way she spoke, no longer as a mother-in-law trying to understand, but as a professional analyst observing a subject of interest. I saw the subtle, almost imperceptible ways she would steer conversations with Leo away from any topic related to their financial state, deftly changing the subject with a bright, distracting comment about a movie or a piece of local news. I noted the practiced brightness in her voice when she'd describe a non-existent job interview, her narrative full of confidence but curiously lacking in verifiable details like company names or interviewer titles. It was a masterful performance of normalcy, a carefully constructed facade designed to project stability and control. But my training had taught me to look at the foundations of such performances, to probe for the hairline cracks in the concrete, and I suspected that Chloe's were crumbling under a weight I could not yet see. The days between that dinner and the eventual discovery were a masterclass in domestic tension, an awkward breakfast where I asked Chloe if she needed any contacts from my old corporate network, only to be met with a sweetly evasive answer about wanting to forge her own path. A quiet afternoon when I saw her hastily conceal at the new expensive-looking handbag in her closet, a purchase that seemed utterly incongruous with the narrative of a woman who had just been downsized. Each of these moments was a small data point, an anomaly that I filed away in my mental ledger. I found myself feeling a profound sense of melancholy for my son, who seemed to be navigating this tense new reality with a willful blindness. Desperate to believe in the integrity of the life he had built, he saw a wife under stress. I saw a subject exhibiting classic patterns of concealment. The opportunity to see the truth behind the performance, as it so often does, arrived not in a moment of dramatic confrontation, but in the quiet, mundane execution of a domestic chore. It was a Tuesday, the day I always changed the bed linens throughout the house. It was a ritual I found comforting, a way of resetting the week and maintaining the sense of order that grounded me. I'd stripped the sheets from my own bed and was moving on to the guest room. The room, like Chloe herself, was impeccably presented on the surface. The bed was made with military precision. Her expensive toiletries were arranged in neat rows on the dresser, and there was not a speck of dust to be seen. But the room felt cold, impersonal, like a high-end hotel suite rather than a temporary home. It lacked the warmth of occupancy, the gentle mess of life being lived. As I gathered the used sheets into a bundle, I noticed Chloe's large, hard-shell suitcase, tucked haphazardly under the bed, was jutting out into the room. It was a small thing, a minor bit of untidiness in an otherwise sterile environment, but it bothered my sense of order. I bent down, intending only to slide it fully under the dust ruffle, when the corner of the heavy canvas caught on the edge of my Persian rug. As I gave it a gentle push to free it, a single piece of paper, stiff and official-looking, dislodged from a compromised seam in the suitcase lining and fluttered silently onto the floor. It landed face down. For a moment, I considered leaving it, respecting the boundary of their closed luggage, their private space. My sense of propriety warred with a deeper, more primal instinct. But the chill from that evening at the dinner table, the memory of her calculating gaze upon my husband's music box, had not yet left me. My instincts, honed over a lifetime of seeking truths people tried to bury in complex financial statements and hidden accounts, urged me forward. This small, forgotten piece of paper felt like a loose thread that, once pulled, might unravel everything. I reached down and picked it up. It was not a personal letter. It was a notice, printed on cheap, gray paper that felt coarse and unforgiving to the touch. Across the top, in an aggressive, bold red font designed to intimidate, were two words that made my blood run cold. Final notice. The letter was from a company I'd never heard of, a place with a predatory sounding name, Granite Peak Financial Services. It was addressed to Chloe, and it was a demand for immediate payment. My eyes scanned the page, my mind automatically shifting into the cold, efficient gear of my former profession. The data processed itself with a grim clarity. The principal amount was staggering, well over $30,000. But it was the itemized interest and penalty fees that took my breath away. They had nearly doubled the original sum, a hallmark of usurious, predatory lending. The language of the letter was not the polite, corporate phrasing of a typical bank. It was the thinly veiled threat of a loan shark dressed in a business suit. It spoke of all necessary measures and asset recovery protocols, phrases that were legal euphemisms for harassment and intimidation. This was not the debt of a person who had overspent on credit cards. This was the debt of someone in a desperate, suffocating trap. In that instant, everything clicked into place with a horrifying, crystalline clarity. The vague story about being downsized, the brittle cheerfulness, the constant, humming tension in her shoulders, the new handbag, the defensive posture when I'd offered to help with her resume. All of these were not just character flaws, they were symptoms of a much deeper disease. And most importantly, the way she had looked at my husband's music box, it was all recontextualized. Her questions had not been born of greed alone, but of a desperate, frantic search for a lifeline. She was not just a schemer, she was a drowning woman, clawing for anything that might keep her head above water. She had looked at my family's most treasured heirloom and had seen not its history or its sentimental value, but a potential cash value, a solution. A profound and chilling sadness washed over me, a grief for the lie my son was living. This was immediately followed by a wave of cold, clear-eyed resolve. The threat was no longer a vague suspicion. It had a name, Granite Peak Financial. It had a number, a figure so large it would drive a person to extremes. Chloe was not just a guest in my home, she was a cornered animal. And I knew, with a certainty that left no room for doubt, that a cornered animal will do anything to escape its trap. The knowledge of that letter changed the very air I breathed. For the next 2 nights, sleep became a stranger. The quiet of my house was no longer peaceful, it was heavy with unspoken truths. I would lie in the darkness, the house silent around me, and my mind would race, replaying every conversation, every glance, every forced smile through this new lens of understanding. I was an analyst with a critical piece of data but an incomplete picture of the resulting plan, and my brain refused to rest. The question was no longer if Chloe would do something, but when and how. The answer came on the second night, a Thursday, just after 2 a.m. I was in that twilight state between waking and sleeping, when a sound, small but distinct, cut through the silence. It was the soft groan of a floorboard on the ground floor, a specific board near the patio door that always complained when stepped on. Richard and I had always meant to fix it. I held my breath, every nerve ending tingling with alert. Another sound followed, the barely audible slide and soft click of the glass patio door being opened and then closed. My heart began to beat a steady, heavy rhythm against my ribs. Leo was a deep sleeper, his breathing a gentle, even cadence from down the hall. This was someone else. I slipped out of bed, my bare feet silent on the cool wood of the floor. Years of needing to be unseen and unheard during sensitive audits had taught me how to move without a sound, to become a ghost in the spaces where I did not belong. I didn't go to my bedroom window, which faced the front yard. Instead, I crept down the hallway to the small study at the back of the house, its large window offering a clear, dark view of the stone patio and the garden beyond. And there she was. Chloe stood bathed in the pale, indifferent light of a half moon. She was a silhouette of nervous energy, pacing back and forth across the flagstones like a caged animal, her phone pressed tightly to her ear. Her posture was tense, her shoulders hunched up to her ears. This was not a casual late night chat. This was a conversation of consequence. My training took over, my mind going cold and clear. Document everything. I unlocked my own phone, my fingers steady as I opened the voice recording app. I pressed the red button and held the phone close, praying its microphone was sensitive enough to capture her words across the manicured lawn. I couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but Chloe's whispers, sharp with a mixture of fear and determination, sliced through the night air with perfect clarity. I know I told you, Marco, I can't get it before then, she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. He's always here. It's impossible. A pause, as she listened, her body rigid. I know what's at stake. You don't think I know that. You don't need to remind me. She stopped pacing and ran a hand through her hair, a gesture of pure, unadulterated desperation. Listen to me, I have a plan, it's clean. It's better than your idea. Another pause, longer this time. His poker game is next Thursday, his weekly game with his partners. He's never home before 11, sometimes later. It's the only window I have. My breath caught in my throat, a painful little knot. She was talking about Leo. She was using my son's simple, predictable routine, a routine she likely feigned disinterest in, as the key to her timeline. The old woman? Chloe let out a short, bitter laugh that held no humor, a sound that was ugly and sharp in the still night. She's no problem. She goes to bed by 9:30 every night like clockwork. She's so predictable. She thinks that music box is just full of old letters and sentimental junk. She has no idea what Richard's family heirlooms are actually worth. My hand tightened on my phone, my knuckles white, the plastic casing groaning under the pressure. The casual, dismissive cruelty of her words was like a physical blow. She saw me as a caricature, a doddering old fool, a predictable and irrelevant part of the scenery, an obstacle to be managed. Yes, the box, she confirmed to the voice on the phone, her own voice now gaining a measure of confidence, of resolve. Everything is in the box. I'll have it Thursday night. By Friday. You'll have your money, and we can be done with this. Just be ready. She ended the call, plunging the patio into silence once more. She stood there for a long moment, alone. Dark figure in the moonlight, taking a few deep, steadying breaths before sliding the door open and slipping back inside the house. I stood frozen in the darkness of the study, the recording a silent, damning testament on my phone. The final piece of the puzzle had just snapped into place with brutal precision. The threat now had a plan. It had a date, a time, and a target, and my role. I understood with absolute, chilling clarity. Had just shifted from observer to adversary. My home was not just a target, it was about to become a battleground, and I would not lose. The recording on my phone was a cold, hard artifact, a digital ghost of a conversation that had sealed my daughter-in-law's fate. In the week that followed that moonlit night, my home transformed. On the surface, nothing had changed. We still shared meals, made polite conversation, and went through the motions of a family living under one roof. But beneath that fragile veneer, the house had become a silent stage of observation. I now possessed a terrible kind of foresight. I knew the script of the crime that was to be committed within my own walls. Every interaction, every word was now filtered through this knowledge. My role was no longer simply to suspect, but to watch, to wait, and to prepare for the inevitable performance on Thursday night. My focus, however, was not solely on Chloe. I began to watch my son, Leo, with a new and painful intensity, looking for any sign that he sensed the tremors beneath the foundation of his own marriage. It began subtly. Leo, who had always been the anchor of any room he was in, seemed to have lost his moorings. A quietness had settled over him, a pensive shadow in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He would sit at the dinner table, pushing food around his plate, his mind clearly miles away. He made an effort to engage, to maintain the facade of normalcy for my sake. But I could see the strain. I saw it in the way his smile never quite reached his eyes, in the forced lightness of his laughter. He was a man trying to hold together a world he felt slipping through his fingers, and my heart ached for the pain he was trying so hard to conceal. Not just from me, but from himself. His unease, I soon realized, was being constantly fed by Chloe's increasingly erratic behavior. The phone calls became more frequent. Chloe's phone, once a casual accessory, was now a source of constant anxiety. It would buzz on the counter, and she would snatch it up with a speed that was almost violent, her eyes darting around to see who was watching before she'd hurry into the garden or out to the front porch, her voice dropping to an indecipherable whisper. I already knew the name of the man on the other end of the line was Marco, a name that now echoed in my mind with a grim resonance, but Leo did not. I watched my son watch his wife, a knot of confusion and hurt tightening on his face with each secretive call. He was trying to reconcile the woman he loved with the stranger she was becoming, and the cognitive dissonance was wearing him down. The breaking point, or rather, the first visible crack in his denial, came on a Sunday afternoon. We were in the living room, the air thick with the unspoken tension that had become our new normal. I was pretending to read a novel. Leo was sketching in his notepad, and Chloe was scrolling through her phone. She stood up to get a glass of water, leaving her phone face up on the coffee table beside him. A moment later, the screen lit up with a new message notification. I saw Leo's eyes flicker towards it, not out of a desire to snoop, but from the simple, reflexive habit of a shared life. I saw his body go rigid. From my vantage point, I couldn't read the words, but I could read the profound and immediate change in my son. The color drained from his face, his posture stiffening as if he'd taken a physical blow. Chloe returned, and seeing his expression, she immediately knew. A flicker of pure panic crossed her face before she replaced it with a look of practiced concern. I watched the silent, tense drama unfold. Leo picked up her phone, his hand trembling slightly, and showed her the screen. The conversation that followed was a hushed, frantic ballet of accusation and defense. I could not hear all the words, only fragments carried on the tense air Leo's pained, questioning tone. Who is Marco? Chloe. Why is he saying this? And Chloe's voice, a desperate, high-pitched whisper, pleading with him to talk in private. They retreated to the guest room, and the muffled sounds of their argument felt like a violation of the house's peace. An hour later, they emerged. Chloe's eyes were red-rimmed from crying, and she clung to Leo's arm, the very picture of a wronged, vulnerable woman. Leo looked shattered, but he had a new, fragile calm about him. Later that evening, he came to me in the kitchen, his expression heavy with a weary resolve. He explained that Chloe had confessed everything, or rather, she had confessed a carefully edited version of everything. This Marco, he explained, was a manipulative former business partner from a venture that had gone sour years ago, long before he and Chloe had even met. The man was now trying to extort her, using old, fabricated debts as leverage. She was just trying to protect me from it. Mom, Leo said, his voice hollow as he recited the lines he so desperately wanted to believe. She was scared and embarrassed. I simply nodded, placing a hand on his arm. It was not the time to present my own evidence, the seed of doubt. However, I could see, had been irrevocably planted. He had accepted her story for now, but the trust, once so absolute, had been fractured. He was no longer just a loving husband, he was a man on alert, and a part of him was now watching, just as I was. With Leo's suspicion awakened, my own path became clearer. I was no longer just a passive observer waiting for a crime to happen. I was an active strategist, preparing the field of battle. The clock was ticking. I had 4 days until Thursday. My work began with a simple, domestic lie. On Monday morning, I announced that I was going to spend the day visiting an old friend from my auditing days and would likely be back late. It was a perfect cover, plausible and requiring no further explanation. But my destination was not a friend's house. My first stop was a small, unassuming electronics shop downtown, the kind that specialized in surveillance equipment for private investigators. The young man behind the counter barely blinked when I described what I needed: a motion activated camera, high definition, with excellent night vision, and above all, undetectable. He showed me a device disguised perfectly as a common USB wall charger. It was a marvel of modern espionage, a silent, digital witness that could be placed in plain sight. My next task was more specialized. My years in forensic accounting had connected me with a wide network of professionals, including those who supplied materials for tracking and evidence recovery. I knew that what I needed wasn't available in any normal store, from a secure browser on a library computer. I accessed the website of a chemical supply company that catered to law enforcement and forensic labs. I found what I was looking for: a small vial of ultra-fine, forensic-grade UV tracking powder. It was colorless, odorless, and nearly invisible to the naked eye. But under an ultraviolet light, it would fluoresce with a brilliant, unmistakable glow. It was the quiet, irrefutable evidence I needed. I paid for it with a prepaid card and had it shipped for overnight delivery to a private mail service, leaving no trace back to my home. The package arrived on Tuesday. I waited until Wednesday afternoon, when both Leo and Chloe were out of the house for several hours, for a supposed job interview she had. The house was silent, my ally in this delicate operation. I retrieved the small vial from my purse and walked into the living room, my heart beating with a steady, clinical rhythm. This was not an act of anger or revenge, it was a procedure, the final step in building an airtight case, with the delicate touch of a surgeon. I opened the music box. I carefully removed the few genuine, but sentimentally priceless, letters from my husband and replaced them with a bundle of old, meaningless stationery. I then placed the bait: a few pieces of my mother's old costume jewelry, gaudy and worthless, and a heavy, ornate-looking antique key that belonged to nothing. Then, I opened the vial. The powder was like dust, finer than flour. Using a tiny, soft-bristled artist's brush, I applied a nearly invisible layer to each piece of fake jewelry and, most importantly, all over the surface of the fake key. Anyone who touched these items would have their hands and fingers thoroughly contaminated. I closed the music box, its secret now armed and waiting. The final step was placing the witness. I took the USB charger camera and plugged it into the wall outlet just beside the bookshelf, partially obscured by a hanging plant. It had a perfect, unobstructed view of the mantelpiece. I connected it to my phone via a secure app. Checking the live feed, the angle was flawless. I adjusted the motion detection sensitivity and confirmed the night vision was crystal clear. The trap was set. Every piece was in place. I looked at the music box, sitting innocently on the mantel, a silent testament to a lifetime of love, now repurposed as the centerpiece in a drama of profound betrayal. There was nothing left to do but wait for the curtain to rise on Thursday night. The house on Wednesday night was a place of deep, deceptive calm. The trap was set. The silent witness was in place. And every component of my plan was locked in. There was a strange finality to it, a sense that I had done all I could. Now, I was simply a spectator waiting for the play to begin. I slept surprisingly well that night, the sleep of a strategist who is prepared for every contingency. When I awoke on Thursday morning, it was to a world bathed in a crisp, autumnal light, a world that seemed entirely unaware of the drama it was about to host. The day unfolded with a kind of slow-motion tension. Every tick of the grandfather clock in the hall felt like a countdown, each chime marking an hour closer to the designated time of betrayal. Chloe was a ghost of her usual self, The brittle, performative cheerfulness had been replaced by a quiet, nervous energy that vibrated from her in palpable waves. She spent most of the day in the guest room, the door closed, emerging only for a brief and silent lunch. She claimed she was preparing for a very important remote job interview. But I saw the truth in the dark circles under her eyes and the way her hands trembled as she reached for her water glass. This was not the focus of a professional preparing for a meeting. It was the raw nerved anxiety of a conspirator on the verge of executing a high stakes plan. I watched her, my expression one of gentle, grandmotherly concern. But my mind was a cold, analytical engine, noting every detail. Leo, caught in the middle of this silent storm, was a study in loving obliviousness. He was excited about his weekly poker game, a rare chance to unwind with his partners and escape the quiet tension that had filled his own home. He kissed me goodbye at a little past 6:30 in the evening, promising not to be too late. "Don't wait up, Mom," he said, giving me a hug. "I'll be fine." As he walked out the door, I felt a pang of deep, profound sorrow for him. He was walking away from his life as he knew it, and when he returned, the woman he had married would be irrevocably changed in his eyes. When the sound of his car faded down the street, an almost theatrical silence descended upon the house. It was now just me and Chloe. The stage was set. I went through my evening routine with deliberate, measured slowness, a performance for an audience of one. I washed the few dinner dishes, tidied the kitchen, and settled in the living room with a book, positioning myself so I could see the mantelpiece. Chloe remained upstairs. The minutes stretched into an hour. The sun set, and the house filled with the long shadows of early evening. I knew her plan was to wait until I had gone to bed. My part in this drama required me to follow the script she had written for me at precisely 9:30, just as she had predicted in her phone call. I closed my book, turned off the living room lamp, and made my way upstairs. But the true opening act of the night's drama was about to begin, and it arrived in a form I had anticipated but still dreaded the sharp, intrusive ring of the doorbell. It was an alien sound in the tense quiet of the evening. My heart gave a single, hard jolt against my ribs. I wasn't expecting anyone. Leo had his keys, and no one else in Crestwood would visit unannounced at this hour. I moved to the front door, my mind racing through possibilities. But a cold part of me already knew. This had to be him. This had to be Marco. I switched on the porch light and looked through the peephole, and my suspicions were confirmed. The man standing on my doorstep was not a friendly neighbor. He was tall and lean, dressed in a black leather jacket that seemed too thin for the autumn chill. His dark hair was slicked back, and a faint, jagged scar cut through his left eyebrow. He was handsome in a way that was entirely predatory, and even through the distorted glass, I could see the cold, impatient look in his eyes. I took a deep, steadying breath, smoothed the front of my cardigan, and opened the door, leaving the security chain engaged. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice calm and polite. The voice of any grandmother interrupted in her evening. His eyes swept over me, a quick, dismissive appraisal, before focusing on the space behind me, looking for someone else. "I'm here to see Chloe," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was smooth, but with a gravelly undertone, like silk being dragged over concrete. "I'm afraid you've missed her," I replied, keeping my tone even. "She and my son have gone out for the evening." It was a simple, protective lie. The last thing I wanted was for him to know Chloe was here and vulnerable. A smile touched his lips, but it was a cold, empty thing that held no warmth or humor. "Is that so?" he murmured, leaning against the doorframe with a casual insolence. "That's a shame. We had some business to discuss. A pressing financial matter." He looked directly into my eyes, and I felt that the deliberate, menacing weight of his gaze. This was the moment. This was the threat. "Just tell her Marco stopped by," he continued, his voice dropping slightly. And tell her I hope she has a productive evening. It's always best when people settle their accounts on time. It keeps things from getting complicated. The word hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. It was a perfectly crafted threat, delivered with the plausible deniability of a legitimate businessman. My years of deposing hostile witnesses took over. I did not show fear. I did not react. I simply held his gaze, my expression unreadable. I will give her the message, I said quietly. He seemed to search my face for a flicker of fear or weakness, and finding none, he pushed himself off the door frame with a sigh of faint annoyance. You do that, he said, before turning and walking down the path to a dark, nondescript sedan parked at the curb. I watched until the car's taillights disappeared around the corner. Only then did I close and lock the door, my heart finally hammering against my ribs. The abstract threat from a letter and a whispered phone call had just stood on my doorstep. It was no longer just about the betrayal of a daughter-in-law. It was about a real, physical danger that had now breached the sanctity of my home. I stood in the hallway for a long time, the silence of the house pressing in on me. I heard a faint creak from the floorboards above. Chloe had been listening. She knew he had been here, and I imagined her panic. Her desperation now ratcheted up to an unbearable level. His visit didn't change my plan, but it added a new, critical layer to it. I now had a powerful tool of misdirection. The rest of the evening passed in a state of suspended animation. I went to my room, but I did not sleep. I watched the live feed from the camera on my tablet, the image of my dark, silent living room a testament to the trap that lay in wait. The hours ticked by. 10 o'clock. 10:30. Leo returned just after 11, his mood light and cheerful from his evening with friends. The moment he saw my face, his smile faded, replaced by immediate concern. I had allowed the genuine shock and fear from Marco's visit to settle in my expression. I looked like what I was, a frightened older woman. Mom, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost, he said. Rushing to my side, I let out a shaky breath, playing my part perfectly. Leo, I'm so glad you're home, I began, my voice trembling slightly. We had a visitor earlier. A man, a very unsettling man. I recounted the story, editing it for my purposes. I described Marco accurately: the jacket, the scar, the cold eyes. I told Leo he had asked for Chloe by name. I repeated his veiled threat about settling accounts. I framed it all through the lens of a terrified mother. He said his name was Marco. Leo. He was so intimidating. I was frightened. He was talking about money. I don't understand what's going on. Leo's face hardened, the cheerfulness from his poker game evaporating, replaced by the cold anger of a protective son. Did Chloe say who he was? He asked, his voice tight. She's been in her room all evening, I said, a truthful statement that implied she was hiding. This was my moment. I leaned on his arm, a gesture of maternal frailty. Leo, with everything going on, and now strange men showing up at our door, it makes me so worried about security, I said, my voice thick with manufactured anxiety. You know that little security camera I bought? The one that looks like a USB charger. I'm so glad I put it in the living room. But now I'm terrified I didn't set it up correctly, then I don't know if it's even recording. I looked up at him, my eyes wide with worry. Could you please, just for my peace of mind, could you check it? Make sure the motion sensor is active and that it's recording properly? I need to know it's working, just as I knew he would. Leo immediately went into protector mode. Of course, Mom, don't you worry, he said, his voice full of reassurance. He took out his own phone, and I guided him through connecting to the camera's app. I watched as he stood in the living room, checking the live feed on his screen. He confirmed the angle was perfect, capturing the entire mantelpiece. He tested the motion detection, waving his hand in front of the lens and watching the notification pop up. "It's perfect, Mom," he said, showing me the screen. "The connection is strong, and it's set to record any movement. Nothing can happen in here without us getting it on video." He thought he was reassuring his frightened mother. He had no idea he was acting as the chief verifier of my evidence chain. He had just become my key witness, the one who could testify that the surveillance system was fully operational and perfectly positioned hours before any crime was committed. I gave him a grateful hug, a mixture of profound sadness for the pain he was about to endure and a grim satisfaction at the clinical perfection of my plan. He went up to bed, leaving me alone in the quiet darkness. The final piece was in place. The witness was established. The trap was armed. The thief was in the house. And the night was still young. After Leo went upstairs, the house fell into a profound and expectant silence. The gentle rhythm of his footsteps faded, replaced by the steady, resonant ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound that was no longer a comfort, but the relentless counting down of the final minutes of my son's innocence. I retreated to my bedroom, but not to the warmth of my bed. I settled into the high-backed armchair in the corner, a silent sentinel in the darkness, my tablet resting in my lap. On its screen, the live feed from the USB camera displayed my living room in the ghostly grayscale of night vision. The familiar shapes of my furniture, the sofa, the bookshelves, the mantelpiece all seemed alien and fraught with tension. The music box sat in the center of the frame, a silent, patient trap. There was nothing left to do now but keep the vigil. The hours bled into one another. Midnight came and went, announced by the deep, melancholic chimes of the clock. 1 o'clock. The house settled deeper, the old wood groaning as it cooled. Sounds I knew intimately, but which now seemed to carry a new, ominous weight. My mind, sharp and alert, did not dwell on anger. Instead, I found myself adrift in a sea of sorrow, thinking of the young, hopeful man my son had been on his wedding day, his eyes full of absolute trust for the woman at his side. I thought of Chloe, not as a monster, but as a desperate woman whose own poor choices had led her to this precipice. There was no victory in this for me, only the grim necessity of a surgeon excising a sickness before it could consume the entire body. This was not revenge, it was a painful, necessary amputation. At precisely 2:17 a.m., a notification flashed silently across the top of my tablet's screen. Motion detected. My breath caught in my chest. On the screen, a shadow detached itself from the deeper shadows of the upstairs hallway. My heart began a slow, heavy beat, a drum signaling the start of the final act. I watched, my mind a cold, clear lens of observation. As Chloe descended the stairs, she moved with an unnatural grace, a practiced stealth that spoke of forethought, her feet finding the exact center of each tread to avoid the telltale creaks. She was dressed in dark clothing, a slim silhouette against the faint moonlight filtering through the windows. She was no longer my daughter-in-law. She had transformed into a professional, a thief in her own home. She paused at the bottom of the stairs, her head cocked, listening to the silence for a long, agonizing minute, satisfied. She glided into the living room, her movements economical and purposeful. There was no hesitation. She moved directly to the mantelpiece, her target clear and her resolve absolute. The high-definition camera captured every detail with a chilling clarity. I saw her hands, steady and sure. As she lifted the lid of the music box, the faint, metallic click of the latch felt as loud as a gunshot in the silent room of my mind. I watched as her fingers, long and delicate, rummaged inside, pushing aside the bundle of decoy letters I had placed on top. Her hands closed around the worthless, gaudy pieces of my mother's costume jewelry and the heavy, ornate key. I saw a flicker of triumph on her face, the brief, predatory smile of a scavenger who believes they have found treasure. She dropped the items into her large, expensive-looking handbag, which she had slung over her shoulder. For a moment, she stood there, looking at the open box, perhaps considering if there was anything more. Then, with a final, decisive click, she closed the lid, wiping the surface with the sleeve of her sweater to remove any fingerprints. It was the move of a careful criminal, and it sealed my resolve. She gave the room one last sweeping glance, and with a look of profound relief and victory on her face, she turned to leave, and the crime was complete. My turn had come. The moment Chloe's back was to the camera, I moved. I placed the tablet on the chair, my own body moving with the same silent purpose she had displayed. In my hand, I clutched the small, pen-sized UV flashlight I had retrieved from my desk drawer hours earlier. I did not hurry. My steps were deliberate as I exited my room and moved down the hallway. I reached the top of the stairs just as she was crossing the foyer below, a shadow moving towards the front door, towards her escape. I did not call out her name, I simply reached for the main light switch for the foyer. With a flick, the space was flooded with a brilliant, unforgiving light. Chloe froze instantly, her hand on the doorknob, caught like a deer in the headlights of an oncoming car. She spun around, her face a mask of pure shock, her eyes wide and blinded by the sudden glare. "Evelyn!" she gasped, her voice a strangled whisper. She immediately began to compose herself, her mind scrambling for an excuse. "My God, you startled me. I I couldn't sleep. I was just going to get a glass of water." The lie was quick, but it was clumsy. "The kitchen is in the other direction, Chloe," I said, my voice dangerously calm as I began my slow descent down the stairs. "And people don't usually take their handbags with them to get a glass of water in the middle of the night." She clutched the strap of her bag defensively, pulling it tighter against her body. Her shock was quickly being replaced by a defiant anger. "What are you implying?" she snapped, her voice rising. "What is wrong with you? Sneaking around in the dark? You're acting crazy." It was a classic misdirection, an attempt to paint me as the unstable one. "Am I?" I asked, reaching the bottom of the stairs and taking a step towards her. "Or am I finally seeing things with perfect clarity?" The sound of our raised voices, sharp and unnatural in the dead of night, had broken the house's slumber. A light flicked on at the top of the stairs. A door opened. "Mom, Chloe." Leo's voice was thick with sleep and confusion. "What in the world is going on down there?" He appeared at the top of the stairs, squinting in the bright light, a portrait of bewildered concern. Chloe's face changed instantly. She saw her escape route, her protector. "Leo, thank God," she cried, her voice now filled with a theatrical tremor. "Your mother, she's not well. She's accusing me of I don't even know what." Leo started down the stairs, his eyes darting between his weeping. Hysterical wife and me, his calm, silent mother. "Mom, what is this about?" he asked, his voice pleading. I ignored Chloe's performance. I looked directly at my son, and with a voice full of the sorrowful weight of the truth, I said the line I had been rehearsing in my mind. "Leo, I think there is something you need to see." Before anyone could react, I took the final 2 steps towards Chloe. She flinched as I came near. "What are you doing?" "Get away from me," she shrieked. "I didn't touch her. I simply raised the small flashlight." "Chloe, for Leo's sake, please, just show us your hands," I said. Then, I clicked the button. A beam of focused, violet light shot out, illuminating her in its strange, purple glow. For a second, nothing happened. Then, as the light passed over her hands, the invisible became terrifyingly visible. Her fingertips, her palms, the nails she had so perfectly manicured, they all blazed with a brilliant, ghostly blue-green light. The UV powder had done its work. The light caught the clasp of her handbag, which glowed with the same incriminating luminescence. A collective gasp filled the silence. Chloe stared at her own hands as if they belonged to an alien, her mouth agape in pure, uncomprehending horror. The evidence was irrefutable. written on her very skin in a language of light that no lie could erase. I moved the beam from her hands to her face, a face now frozen in a rictus of guilt and terror. I then turned to look at my son. Leo stood halfway down the stairs, frozen in place, his face a canvas of utter devastation. He stared at his wife's glowing hands, then at my face, then back again. I could see his mind working. The pieces of the puzzle, the secretive calls, the tense silences, the story about Marco. His mother's fear all crashing together to form this one. Single. Horrifying image. The trap had been sprung, the unmasking was complete, and in that silent, blue glowing moment, my son's world fell completely and irrevocably apart. The silence that followed the revelation was a living entity, thick and suffocating. It was broken only by a ragged, desperate gasp from Chloe as she stared at her own glowing hands, the physical manifestation of her betrayal. In the purple glare of the ultraviolet light, her beautiful, composed face had crumpled into a mask of pure horror. She looked from her hands to me, then to Leo, her mind visibly racing for a lie, for an escape hatch from a cage made of irrefutable truth. But there were no exits left. Leo remained frozen on the stairs, his face a hollow landscape of devastation. It was the look of a man watching the entire architecture of his life collapse into dust in a single, silent moment. He wasn't just seeing a thief. He was seeing the ghost of the woman he thought he had married. It's... it's a trick, Chloe stammered, her voice a thin, reedy sound. Some kind of joke. Leo, she's trying to frame me. The accusation was so ludicrous, so desperate, that it died in the heavy air. Leo didn't even seem to hear her. He was still locked in his own private world of shock. I knew that the visual evidence, as powerful as it was only the first part of the unmasking. He needed to hear the truth in her own voice. I calmly reached into the pocket of my housecoat and retrieved my phone. There's more. Leo, I said, my own voice a quiet counterpoint to Chloe's rising panic. I think you need to hear this. I found the recording from that night in the garden and pressed play. Chloe's own voice, a cold, conspiratorial whisper, filled the silent foyer. His poker game is next Thursday. He'll be out with his partners from 7 until at least 11. It's the only window I have. I saw a tremor run through Leo's body as he recognized his wife's voice plotting to use his own routine against his family. The recording continued, each word a hammer blow against the fragile remains of his trust. The old woman. She's no problem. She goes to bed by 9:30 every night like clockwork. She thinks that music box is just full of old letters and sentimental junk. She has no idea what Richard's family heirlooms are actually worth. At the sound of those words, the casual, contemptuous dismissal of me as the old woman. The cold calculation of her betrayal, something inside Chloe finally broke. Hearing her own treachery laid bare, with no room left for denial. She let out a gut-wrenching sob and sank to the floor amidst the damning blue glow. The confession that followed was not a neat, orderly narrative, but a torrent of desperate, ugly truths that spilled out of her. She spoke of the online gambling that started as a distraction and spiraled into a devastating addiction. She confessed to the tens of thousands of dollars in high-interest debt. And to Marco, who was not a former business partner, but a ruthless loan shark whose threats had become increasingly violent and personal. She admitted, through ragged breaths, that her job loss hadn't been a downsizing. She had been fired for embezzling company funds to try and cover her losses. The plan to steal from the music box was her last, desperate gambit, a way to pay off Marco and run, hoping to drag Leo along with some story of a new job offer in another state before I even noticed anything was missing. She laid the entire sordiente story at our feet, a testament to a life built on a foundation of secrets and lies throughout it all. Leo just stood there on the stairs, listening. I watched as the shock on his face was slowly replaced by a profound and chilling emptiness. The love he had for her, once so bright and unwavering, was being extinguished before my very eyes, leaving behind nothing but cold, gray ash. When her confession finally trailed off into exhausted sobs, Leo slowly walked down the rest of the stairs. He did not look at her with anger or hatred, but with a look of utter, devastating finality, the look one gives to a stranger. He walked past her, went to the front door, and opened it, letting the cold night air rush into the brightly lit foyer. He then turned to face her, his voice devoid of all emotion, a flat, dead tone that was far more terrifying than any shout could have been. "Get your things," he said, "and get out of my mother's house, now." Chloe looked up, her tear-streaked face a mess of disbelief and pleading. "Leo, please," she began. He did not waver. "Now," he repeated, his voice unchanged. The command was absolute. The marriage was over. Without another word, Chloe stumbled to her feet and walked, defeated, to the guest room, leaving behind a trail of invisible, glowing evidence of her guilt. A few minutes later, she emerged with her bags, her face pale and empty. She did not look at either of us as she walked out the door. The soft click of the lock as Leo turned the deadbolt was the final punctuation mark on that chapter of our lives. 4 months later, the house on Sycamore Lane had found its rhythm again. The silence that now filled its rooms was not the tense, watchful silence of before, but a deep, comforting peace. The ghost of Chloe's sharp perfume had long since faded, replaced once more by the familiar, gentle scents of old books, lemon polish, and the jasmine blooming in the garden just outside the kitchen window. The healing had been a slow and quiet process. The immediate aftermath had been a blur of lawyers and painful discoveries as the full extent of Chloe's financial deceptions came to light. Leo had navigated it all with a grim, quiet dignity that made my heart ache with a mixture of sorrow and pride. He had moved back into his old bedroom, and in the shared silence of our evenings, we slowly began to piece together a new sense of normal. His grief was a quiet thing, but I saw it in the moments when he would stare off into the distance, his mind clearly replaying the betrayal. But as winter thawed into a cool, bright spring, I saw the light slowly return to his eyes. He poured his energy into his work, his architectural designs taking on a new, bolder confidence. He started spending more time with me, not out of obligation, but out of a rediscovered comfort. We would sit in the kitchen on Sunday mornings, sipping coffee and reading the paper. The easy silence between us a testament to a bond that had been tested by fire and had emerged stronger, purer. He was healing, and the house was healing with him. One Tuesday morning, I was in the sunroom, enjoying a cup of tea and looking through a catalog of rare rose bushes. When my phone rang, the name on the screen was one I hadn't seen in years, David Chen, my former partner at the accounting firm. "Evelyn," he said, his voice as warm and familiar as if we had just spoken yesterday. "I hope I'm not disturbing your well-earned retirement, but we have a situation here, and your name was the only one that came to mind." He went on to describe a complex case of corporate fraud, a labyrinth of offshore accounts and falsified ledgers so intricate that his best young auditors were completely stumped. "We don't need an auditor, Evie," he said. "We need an artist. We need your eye for the patterns, for the story and the numbers that no one else can see. Would you consider coming in, just as a consultant?" I looked out the window at my peaceful garden, at the quiet, orderly life I had rebuilt. The offer was a call from a world I had left behind, a world of deception and high-stakes puzzles. A few months ago, I would have politely declined without a second thought. But something had shifted within me. The skills I had honed over a lifetime, the instincts I had feared were growing dull, had not only saved my home and my son, they had reawakened something within me. My greatest and most personal case had been solved right here, in my own living room. My victory hadn't been loud or vengeful. It had been quiet, precise, and absolute. It was a victory of intellect over desperation, of truth over deception. A small smile touched my lips. Tell me more, David, I said, my voice clear and steady. Tell me everything. The battle for my home was over, but I had a feeling my work was just beginning.